freedom. Yes, yes, absolutely. Go for it. You choose your chairs.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to see everyone here, and it's just slightly surreal to be in a room with lots of people and to be on a stage in person with human beings. So the title of this event is Organising for a Planet on Fire, and I'm very grateful to Myri for that title. I think it's brilliant for a few reasons. But more than anything, because I think it really speaks to the moment that we're living in, and how not only is it about addressing the urgency of the moment, but actually how the urgency itself might pose challenges for our organising and for especially the focus on justice and equality. So before I go through what the layout of the event will be, I'd just like to introduce you to our two amazing speakers today, and I'll let them do that themselves because they do it best themselves. So we've got Jen Deeringwater.
So OCO, hello. For those of you who might have been here a little while ago, you get a double feature of me tonight. This is my angry talk. So I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, which is a federally recognized tribal nation in the so-called US. I say so-called because the United States is not. It's an illegal occupying force. It's not what we call our lands. So I am a journalist. I am the founding executive director of Crushing Colonialism, which is an indigenous media organization. I'm also bisexual and two-spirit and multiply disabled. All of who I am informs the work that I do, and it all comes together in the work that I do covering the climate movement. I try to really talk about these issues and cover them in a way that is really intersectional, because the climate crisis is impacting our communities in vast and varying ways, but it's all incredibly important and needs to be covered in a complete and full way. I live on occupied Piscataway land, which is known as Washington, D.C. I was raised on my nation's reservation in rural parts of northeastern Oklahoma and in rural areas of West Texas around Abilene, Texas. I grew up around oil and gas. It was just a normal part of daily life where I'm from. Oil derricks are everywhere. I didn't know it as anything out of place, which maybe sounds strange, but it's just kind of a normal thing growing up where I did. I have some family who has worked in dirty energy. So, you know, I come to this talk today from a variety of perspectives. So, Wado, thank you.
Thanks so much. I feel like that deserves another applause. And we've got other speaker as well, very excited to introduce Andreas Malm.
Yeah. Am I using this microphone or only this? Or both?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am an associate professor of human ecology at Lund University in Sweden. I've written a couple of books about the various aspects of the climate crisis, most recently together with the Zetkin Collective, White Skin, Black Fuel on the Danger of Fossil Fascism. Yeah, I think that's enough for now.
Well, I'll ask you a wee bit more about background and what kind of brought you both into activism later. But I do feel like I kind of have to start with COP, because COP is about to end, and it is not only failing, but it is sort of consciously failing, I think a lot of us would probably argue. So I feel like even though it is very raw, and I'm sure for both of you, and you've both been in Glasgow in different capacities, I would love to hear what kind of expectations you had of grassroots organising around COP this time, and how those expectations were met or not met. Would you like to start, Jen?
So I'll say that I went in with some pretty low expectations, both of COP itself and of the grassroots response to it. And unfortunately, those expectations have been met. You know, I will say deciding to come and go to COP was a little last minute, so I wasn't able to get it together to get an observer pass. So I wouldn't have been able to go in, but it was so disability inaccessible that even if I'd had the observer pass, I would not have been able to get in. Just the journey here, because the world is made by and for able-bodied people, was incredibly hard, which really pisses me off as an Indigenous person and a disabled person. Indigenous people actually have some of the highest rates of disabilities and chronic illnesses in the US, but also on a global level. And we are on the front lines of the climate crisis, yet we are blocked time and time again for having a seat at the table. Now, I also recognize saying that for better or worse, I'm an American, and so I have more access to the COVID vaccine, whereas I think it's like less than 2% of lower socioeconomic countries have COVID vaccine access. So that vaccine apartheid also played a big role on who got to be at the table in COP, whether it was in the official UN capacity or it was on a grassroots level. But on the grassroots level, it was sadly what I expected. I saw no disability justice framework, which is a constant problem in the climate movement. We have extreme ableism in this movement, and that was very present. You know, we had a strong showing of Indigenous people, which I expected and was wonderful, but at the same time, it was kind of more of the same. You know, the Indigenous people, like on the march on the Global Day of Action, we were supposed to lead the way in our own block, yet white people repeatedly pushed their way into the block. When repeatedly told, please step to the side, please join the following block, the response was no. You know, I saw white people yelling at Indigenous people for saying, please respect that we want to march together. So for me, it just felt like more of the same. By the end of the day, I was so triggered and so angry and so fed up and was like, why the hell did I come here? What was the point? This is just more of the same shit all the time. Why am I here? What is the point? And I guess that's why I keep showing up, because voices, you know, the voices of people who don't have a seat at the table need to be heard. But overall, it was so frustrating. And then also, you know, coming from America and knowing the level of responsibility the US has for the climate crisis and seeing how little responsibility the US government will take is, once again, it's what I expected, but also is just infuriating to see. It's maddening to see someone like Barack Obama, you know, up on a stage criticizing Trump when 5 years ago, right now 5 years ago, I was at Standing Rock covering what was happening with the Dakota Access Pipeline resistance, getting gassed, getting maced, seeing people being shot, and that was under Obama. You know, so for me, it was more of the same. And my very low expectations were unfortunately met. But, you know, I'll say, you try to give it a little positive spin. It does at least give me some hope that when we have events like this, we have conversations like this, seeing, you know, hundreds of thousands of people coming together shows that clearly many of us know that this is an absolute crisis. Time is of the essence. We have no time to waste. So, you know, there's some kernels of hope there.
Thank you. I was thinking about how, you know, you said more of the same. And Andreas, I guess, been in the climate movement for a while now. Have you been to more than one COP? And how does this one compare? And did it also feel for you, in what way did it feel like more of the same?
I've been to, this would be my 4th COP. I've been to 3 others, COP 1, COP 15, COP 21, all of them in Europe. So I'm speaking from a European perspective. I should say that I haven't been inside the blue zone. I went to the green zone once. Otherwise, I've been at the People's Climate Summit. I haven't been able to attend as much as I would have wanted to, partly because I'm here with my family and I've had to take care of my kids. My 7-year daughter is here as well right now. I don't know where she went. But
yeah,
anyway.
She's not there at the moment.
She's somewhere here in the room. So I can just give some general reflections. I should also say that I'm not up to date with what's going on or what's happened today inside the summit itself. It's about to come to an end. Obviously, there's been that shared statement from the US and China and some other initiatives that are easy to dismiss, of course, but that I also think can have some potential importance, as some of these things have had before. Now, starting with the demonstration that happened on Saturday, I think it was great. There was a lot of people out. There was a good turnout despite the rain. Roughly around 100,000 people. And if you add to that the other events happening in the UK, in London and elsewhere, this would, I think, count as the largest COP demonstration. We organized a demonstration in Copenhagen back in 2009 for COP 15, which was roughly the same size. But it's again a little bit of the feeling of more of the same for me as well, because we've been having these kinds of demonstrations for a very long time, and these alternative summits are quite standardized, quite ritual in character, if you see what I mean. Almost reflecting the ritual nature of the COP summits themselves. It's pretty similar themes in the discussions. The demonstrations look not so unfamiliar. And there is an inability of the climate movement to make a real impact on what's going on inside, or generally what's happening, because the climate movement is fundamentally quite powerless and is struggling to find some kind of tactic that can make a real difference. And the police congratulated activists for having such an orderly demonstration where no one even threw any litter. And to me, that isn't necessarily a sign of success. And the reports that I've got from comrades inside the blue zone suggest that the actual negotiations go on as though nothing is happening outside. There's no inside-outside dynamic. It's complete hermetic separation between what's going on in there and what we have tried to do outside. And this I think, is actually worse than in some previous COPs, but that also has to do with the dynamics of the climate negotiations themselves and what happened when the whole framework of mandatory obligatory emissions cuts was ditched in favor of these voluntary NDCs that I think caused a radical change in how COPs operate in relation to social movements and things like that. So, I mean, given the nature of our moment, the depth of the climate crisis, the season in hell that we've just lived through this summer in so many parts of the world, and given the continuous investments in oil and gas and coal, including in this country itself, one would have wished for more rage, more anger on the streets. At least I would have done so. And another level of militancy that we still don't see in the climate movement. And I think that's unfortunate. These COPs are, for the climate movement as I see it, primarily occasions for solidifying networks and thinking about next steps and campaigns and a general, of course, analysis of the situation and exchanging ideas and things like that. What's going on inside the summits is becoming less and less important, and that's been the trend for quite some time. I think that this has been another occasion for meaningful exchange and contact and strategizing within the climate movement. So I'd like to give the organizers of the People's Summit credit for creating that space. It's a very important space that will be entirely eradicated next year because COP27 will be held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, which is a way of rewarding Abdel Fattah el-Sisi for having crushed the Egyptian revolution. It's also a way to guarantee that there will be no dynamic, no presence of social movements in the process whatsoever. So that's just, I mean, as you know, the security, almost the militarization of the COP space have been quite salient here, and it's a trend that's been going on for some time, and it will be, I mean, it will be completely consummated when this happens in Sharm el-Sheikh next year. So the loss of that space next year is unfortunate in many respects, but I think next COP should be an opportunity to use that occasion, that date in the calendar, for having mass actions of a radical nature all over and not focused on the particular spot because it's completely inaccessible to everyone.
You mentioned, you know, radical mass actions, and you also mentioned a lack of rage. Is that something that you kind of relate to at all, Jen, the lack of rage? Because I can imagine that there is a bit of there's a question here as well about what do we talk about when we talk about the climate movement? And actually, let me start there. Is there a way in which talking about the climate movement as if it were a homogeneous movement, both global north, global south, privilege and minorities, like, is there a way in which that is actually detrimental to the people who are at the front line of actual climate crisis?
I think yes and no. I would say for the indigenous people, there is plenty of rage, plenty of rage. The climate movement as a whole, you know, I think it really comes down to which communities we're talking about who are a part of the larger climate movement. You know, I see plenty of anger and plenty of rage, including, like I said, the indigenous bloc. Like there were a lot of us very angry. I believe their name is Siam Hamilton. They got up, they were one of the first speakers at the rally. They talked about our issues of murdered and missing indigenous women and our children and our people who are going missing because of the man camps, which are makeshift housing for predominantly non-indigenous workers who come into indigenous lands to build pipelines. Our women and children, our people go murdered and missing. They get trafficked, they get raped at very high rates. You know, she got, or I apologize, I don't know their pronouns, but they got up on that stage and they let some rage out. They're from so-called Canada, so they mentioned the Queen, you know, so it's present, it's there. But then I'm just gonna say it, I would look at the white people and I would hear things like, when is Greta coming up? We're so excited to see Greta. And I was like, we're clearly coming to this from very different experiences of why we're all here. So I think, I don't know, it's, you know, I'll use larger terms like climate movement, but I think it really comes down to the communities we're talking about. You know, when I talk with other people in the disability community, for example, like maybe we don't necessarily talk climate crisis, climate movement, but you better believe when the fires were happening this summer, there was fear and there was anger over how people were going to survive. How are we going to evacuate? You know, when hurricane season happens, you know, the people down in the Gulf, how do you evacuate if you don't have money? How do you evacuate if you're disabled? And the answer is you don't. You're left to fucking die. That's what happens. So I see that fear, I see that anger, but it doesn't always come out in we're in the climate movement sort of way. So I don't know, I think it can be detrimental, but I guess sometimes it can be helpful to feel like there is some sort of, at times, larger feeling of urgency from a variety of communities and hearing where everybody is coming from. Yeah.
Let me just clarify that I think a lot of people who were on the streets this Saturday were angry, including Greta herself. I mean, she very eloquently expresses climate rage. And of course, indigenous contingents in the march and many others as well. But the way of enacting this anger is not, as far as I can tell, in proportion to its magnitude, if you see what I mean. I mean, people are still behaving as demonstrators, as protesters in a very civil and largely obedient fashion. And the contrast here is pretty stark with what went on, including in Europe, exactly 20 years ago, when we had this wave of protests against summits, starting of course in the US, in Seattle with the WTO summit, but then continuing with various summits, the EU and the G8 and all these things that sort of culminated in Genoa in 2001, exactly 20 years ago. Now, I'm not saying that there should have been a massive black bloc creating havoc on the streets of Glasgow. I might not necessarily have objected to it, but it's not that would have been the sort of magic bullet. But it still surprises me that the climate movement does not come forth with any kind of more disruptive way of acting out the anger that people have.
I would absolutely agree with that. It was very civil. Yeah, that's how I would call that protest. Civil and obedient. We followed the law, and I don't think that is going to make any real radical change. So I definitely agree. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about strategies then. One thing that struck me, or that has struck me recently, is that you both spoke of experiences of, and certainly in your writing and in your work, talk about different experiences of what we would call direct action. And it struck me that certain parts of the climate movement talk about direct action as a very, very kind of loose term. Like, has it been watered down? What do you actually, each of you, define as direct action? For something to qualify, like who's the target when it comes to climate,
I guess when I think of direct action in climate, and I guess I'm trying to take a moment to think about this, because I'm like, maybe my idea is actually a little ableist, and I never thought of it that way until now. But when I think of direct action in climate, I think of like you are shutting shit down, like you are stopping construction, you're stopping the flow of whatever, you're taking to the trees. But as a disabled person, I'm also like, I can't necessarily do those things. So I feel like I got to think on this now. But yeah, direct action to me means you are actually stopping this stuff. It's not letter writing or phone calls, Yeah.
Well, I think just as the climate movement is a spacious signifier that it can contain a lot of things, and the movement is extremely heterogeneous. The term direct action can involve many different things. But generally I agree with that definition.
I mentioned at the very beginning that about the title, Organising for a Planet on Fire, that it sort of goes both ways, because I certainly have been thinking quite a lot about what happens to the strategies and what happens to the people in the movement, and certainly what happens to the justice aspect of it, or like the root causes, and thinking about the root causes of the climate crisis when fear sort of takes over. So I wanted to talk to you both a little bit about the development over the last few years, or say certainly the last 5 years, when suddenly mainstream media in the global north has started to talk about climate crisis. you know. So first, Jen, like how has that, you know, the surge in climate narratives in mainstream media, what kind of impact has that had on the very rooted environmental justice work of your communities?
Well, there's impact in a number of ways. I think one, we've definitely seen this in the US. And from my limited time here watching commercials and things in Scotland, it seems that this is probably occurring over on this side as well. But there's been this sort of ideal, and it's been entirely put together by fossil fuel, dirty energy, all of that, it's down to individuals to make a difference. Well, you just need to go plant-based, or you just need to recycle, or stop using straws, without any recognition of the fact that every time a, you know, wealthy asshole goes to space, they're letting out more emissions than I'll ever let out in my entire life. So I feel like in some ways it's co-opting that work, it's watering it down, and it's a lie. And then on the flip side of that, I've seen, you know, the large, like the big greens, as we'll call them, kind of piggyback off the work of indigenous frontline folks, like at Standing Rock. Oh, you know, look at what's happening with DAPL. We need to raise money. And then they take that money and they take that power, but they don't actually give it to the communities that are on those front lines. They're not giving it to Black folks in the cities who are suffering from asthma from all the freeways in their communities or whatnot. I don't know, I think we can see that in all of our movements. I mean, we saw that after George Floyd's murder. It went from Black Lives Matter is terrorists to, you know, oh my gosh, we all care about Black lives. And, you know, but it's always just in this very false sort of pretense. It's kind of, well, we're gonna do this to appease the people, calm them down, get them to shut up. But really, we're just gonna keep business as usual.
And that individual, focus on the individual certainly is it's just everywhere, isn't it? When it comes to your work, Andrea, so your most recent book with the Setkin Collective, White Skin and Black Fuel, which is on the rise of, or on fossil fascism. I wonder, it's about for those of you who haven't read it, the relationship between fossil capital and the far right. And I wondered how the sort of rise of fear in climate, of climate collapse of the last decade, how does that sit within that relationship? Like what kind of impact has that had on the relationship between fossil fuel and fossil capital and the far right? That makes sense.
Yeah, well, one of the arguments we make in the book is that the anti-climate politics of the far right can be seen as the most aggressive defense of privileges called into question in the climate crisis. And this can take a number of different forms, but one of the most significant ones, obviously, is the defense of fossil fuels as such and their technologies. And presidents like Trump or Bolsonaro have been very aggressive in resisting any idea of limiting fossil fuels or deforestation in the case of Brazil. And you see similar politics promoted by far-right parties in Europe, such as the AfD in Germany, the Sweden Democrats in my own country in Sweden, the Vox in Spain, the PIS in Poland, and so on and so forth. Then there is also, of course, another aspect to it. It's a very complicated force field, but the idea that we have to defend ourselves against migrants who will be coming in greater numbers in the climate crisis has been taken up by the far right here and there and used for its own ends. If this is, I don't know if this is what you're.
Yeah, because I'm sort of, I guess I'm wondering, part of what we're talking about at least I think, is the danger of a sort of tunnel vision that actually comes when people are afraid. You know, and that sort of leads me to something else that I wanted to ask you about. To me, it seems like, at least in the global north, amongst many climate activists, there is still this notion that urgent lowering of emissions is somehow separate from dealing with the root causes, with inequality, with colonialism, with racism, so the things that actually caused the climate crisis. And I was just wanting to hear from you both if you think, how much power does this narrative actually hold? You know, is this something that you do hear around yourselves in your work, or, yeah, where are we with that kind of story, which is, yeah, really dangerous.
But I partly disagree here, because if you look at by far the most important part of the climate movement in Europe over the past 2-3 years, Fridays for Future, there's a very clear trend for highlighting the deeper roots of the climate crisis. So when the Fridays for Future staged their sort of post-pandemic comeback with the strike on the 24th of September, the manifesto that they put out was quite remarkably saturated with what we would identify as left rhetoric. It was talk about class, racism, colonialism, and foregrounding most affected people and areas as an important concept. And Greta Thunberg herself is more and more talking about colonialism, tweeting about it, using it in her speech as a central category for understanding the climate crisis. So she has, and the movement, Fridays for Future in Europe, they have moved away from the simplistic, listen to the science rhetoric, and are now talking in terms of uproot the system, which was the hashtag and sort of slogan for the strikes on the 24th of September. This sort of radicalization is still at the level of rhetoric, and it has antinomies because, for instance, Greta tweeted towards the end of the 24th of September that today we were striking and we asked world leaders to uproot the system. You can't really ask world leaders to uproot the system. I mean, it's a bit like basing anti-fascist politics in Italy in the 1920s on asking Mussolini to commit suicide. I mean, that's not how these things work.
Would have been interesting.
Yeah, but radicalization is a process. So, and I think, you know, the youth that have been on the streets for the past couple of years with this massive hiatus imposed by the pandemic, obviously extremely unfortunate. But many of these young people, I think, are becoming increasingly frustrated with continued business as usual. And that leads them not to say, oh, we can't deal with the root causes of the climate crisis, we just have to focus on emissions cuts now. In my estimation, it has the opposite, there's at least, not the movement in its entirety, but there is an opposite trend that, okay, it's very hard to win this battle. We need to look deep into its roots, and potentially that could also lead to some kind of tactical radicalization, and not just at the level of words, I think. Then obviously you have other currents within the movement, that are still beholden to the idea of beyond politics, or, you know, that we can have climate politics that sort of just skips antagonisms in society and embraces everyone. That is a major illusion that still exists, of course. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting to me there is that there's a generational gap between those two groups, actually. Yeah. So what do you think, Jen? Like, do you see that generational gap, or is it very different from where you're standing, where you're coming from?
Well, I think in Indigenous community, it's just there across the generations, because how could it not be, you know? But I definitely feel like youth in general are just, in the US, they're just angry for so many reasons, rightfully so, including with the climate crisis. Because what kind of future have they been left with? And it's not a good one, that's for sure. But I don't know, I feel like, I sometimes wonder if maybe, and this is part of where I'm like, I feel like now I need to sit and do some more deep thinking. Like, my group of people that I organize with and stuff, like the non-Indigenous folks, man, they are radical, they're anarchists, they're all of those things, and they're angry, and it's across generations. But then I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about what I see from the, you know, the environmentalist, you know, the people in the Sierra Club or the Audubon Society. There's still very much of the mindset of, let's just keep the colonial system in place. America's great. We just need to do a little tweaking. And I feel like they're the problem more so than anything. I feel like they're kind of the ones keeping us stuck. There seems to be a complete unwillingness to recognize that the system is at fault, it is to blame. You know, I kind of hoped that if nothing else would come out of Trump, that would really, really make people wake up and see, like, America is fucking shit. Our whole system is shit. But once Biden got elected, it was like the liberals and the white environmentalists and whatnot were like, oh, everything's great again. We can go back home. It's fine. We don't need to do this anymore. We're great. You know, it was amazing to me as well, like when I would post about, you know, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Canada and the things that his government has done there in terms of pipelines and stuff. White people just loved him. It was like he could do no wrong. I mean, he could do the most horrific things, and white environmentalists in the US would be like, oh, it's fine. But if I would say, oh, Trump or a Republican has done such and such, then they'd get angry. And I don't know, maybe this is just the byproduct of having a two-party system. I don't know. But, and I feel like I'm starting to ramble.
That is really interesting, though, because it goes back to what you were saying, I think, as well about beyond politics, that obviously it isn't and it never was. Going from that to actually looking at, you know, what you're sort of yearning for, like what kind of strategies would you like to see more of, each of you, in the climate movement, or movements, if we want to be plural? Whoever feels inclined to answer first.
Well, I mean, I can just mention one campaign that I think is extremely promising in its, at least, basic outlines, and that's Collapse Total, that some of you might have heard of. I hope so, maybe not. It's going to be focused on the 2 weeks now after COP, and the idea is to target Total, the single largest private company headquartered in France, which is one of the main climate criminal entities right now, about to start construction of the East Africa crude oil pipeline, which will be the world's longest pipeline. And the call, Collapse Total, has been endorsed by something like 200 organizations, all sorts of climate groups from all over the world, including in the countries where the pipeline is supposed to be built, Uganda and Tanzania. And the call says that we will target Total with a diverse array of tactics through decentralized direct actions in these weeks. Now, I'm not involved in organizing the campaign. It's unclear to me at what level we'll actually see things happening and what this diverse array of tactics will contain. But I think it makes sense to have that kind of campaign, target one company, and I would certainly be in favor of tactics like sabotage and property destruction against the property of this company that is engaging in this horrific pipeline project, not to mention everything else that they're doing. Massive new oil and gas facilities in Iraq, trying to go into the Arctic to drill for more fossil gas and so on. The fact that this can go on in 2021 and with the backing of the French state is just mind-boggling. So certainly I'd be in favor of mass action, demonstrations, climate camps. Well, it's not in Europe, it's not the right time of the year to organize those, but yeah, that kind of action. And also various types of sabotage, ideally against the sites where the pipeline is actually being constructed, but also against Total properties in France. And it still strikes me as strange that we're not seeing any really strong climate movement in France. It's way weaker than in Germany, despite the fact that France is the only country in Europe that has, in Western Europe, that has a really living, vibrant tradition of social struggles that can quite regularly take on fairly militant aspects, with the Gilets jaunes and the Nuit debout and the movement against police brutality and things like that. But they don't have a massive climate movement, and they don't have any movement that is actively targeting Total, even though it's based in their country and is using that country as a base for serious criminal activity. Yeah, so the idea of collapse total is a very good one. I'm not sure that we'll see it, the potential of the idea realized in the coming weeks. I would hope so. I would encourage people who are here in the UK to find Total targets here. They're not very hard to locate, and I know that there will be some things happening closer to where I live. Yeah, this is the kind of campaign that I would like to see more of.
Okay. How about you, Jen? What would you like to see more of?
I would like to see more direct action happening in the US. I would like to see less of the, well, we need to do things in the right way. We need to protest in the right way. You need to do it, you know, go through the court system, blah, blah, blah. You know, I'll say on the one hand, I understand that whatever holds up projects, whatever makes projects more expensive to the point that companies will think twice about having them is important, but ultimately, I want to see people setting up the resistance camps. I want to see people stopping it, you know, taking over that land, holding that space down. I want to see, you know, destruction, basically. I want to see destruction before the pipeline or the mine or whatever, their destruction even comes in. You know, and those are things that I have been trying to think about, like how can we take back the land as indigenous people, but also just, the land is not something to be owned. It's something that we all live on. It's something that should be a part of all of us. And I'm trying to think about, like, how do we take that land back as indigenous people, but also as just people living here, and make it where these projects can't even come in to begin with. And I think in the US that is quite difficult. You know, I've been doing a lot of work in the Central Appalachia region, which is, you know, sort of West Virginia, Ohio, and it's near where the Marcellus and the Utica shales are. And the gas industry just is having a heyday there. They're fracking the hell out of it. You know, it's pipelines, plants, export facilities, cracker plants. And a lot of that even goes to the legacy of coal. Like in West Virginia, even if you own property, you don't own the mineral rights, you just own the surface rights. And that's set up from the history of coal. So now you've got gas fracking, and so these gas companies come in and say, oh no, you don't own the minerals, these are ours now. You know, so it's, for me, it's thinking about how do we just take it all back right from the get-go. And I think that that's going to be things like, it's direct action, it's sabotage. It's just saying, we're going to fucking take this land and live here. Like, we don't care if you say we don't own it. Like, this is ours now. We're just going to take it.
I have so many questions, it's ridiculous, but I'm going to open up to the audience. And we've got Myri with a roaming microphone, I believe. So I think the way we're going to do it is if you can raise your hand if you've got a question, and Myri will come to you, and then we will repeat the question on stage, won't we?
Yeah.
Yes, yes, we will. Yeah.
Don't be shy. Also, there we go. We've got 1 and 2. A wee reminder: the question is a single sentence that ends with a question mark.
Yes, yes. We want loads of questions, so be brief if you can. I'd like to hear from you both on that one.
Yeah. So I'm personally not at all against that. I mean, insofar as I advocated diversity of tactics, that means that we should try all venues. Not all, but I mean, I think it would be terrible if we started, or someone claiming to belong to the climate movement started, you know, assassinating people or something like that, using violence against people. We need to stay on the right side of that line. But I would not. I mean, obviously, the ruling in that court in The Hague that said that Shell has to cut its emissions by, what was it now, 50% to 2040 or whatever it was, something like that. I mean, that was a good thing, regardless of whether it will actually be implemented, but it puts a kind of pressure on the company, and it increases the legitimacy of direct action against Shell as well. So yeah, I'm for suing companies in courts. I'm also for parliamentary campaigns such as the Sanders campaign or the Corbyn campaign, even though both of them lost. But I mean, almost everything we do ends up in defeat. So you can't say that because of a defeat that was the wrong thing to do. Yeah, so working within the institutions of the existing state apparatuses is, to me, not inherently wrong. I just think that the climate movement also needs a more confrontational and militant edge than it has had so far.
I just realized that we didn't repeat the question for those at home, so I'm going to do that now. The question was about whether you two see a role for suing, working within the legal system as part of the climate movement, or if it's too much within the system. And now, Jen, thank you.
Well, we Americans are quite litigious. We do love to sue. Diversity of tactics, absolutely. I think, once again, whatever makes these companies think twice. You know, we had Dominion Energy was trying to put through the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and they pulled the plug. You know, they saw everybody standing up and fighting against the Mountain Valley Pipeline. They saw the resistance to the ACP, Atlantic Coast Pipeline. They pulled the plug. And I think that took a diversity of tactics. It took, you know, the settlers who were the landowners, you know, going to the government and throwing a fit. It took people, you know, refusing to sign over their land. It took people taking to trees, doing lockdowns. So I think whatever makes it as inconvenient as possible, it makes it as costly as possible, because let's be real, we cannot appeal to their humanity because they have no humanity. All we can do is try to make them go, this is going to be a really expensive and too much fucking trouble. We're not going to be bothered. But I think at the same time, we have to remember that the government and the corporations are in cahoots. You know, I mean, tribal nations in the US are constantly suing the federal government for not honoring trust and treaties. Most of the time we lose, but we keep doing it because, God damn it, we're on the right side. You know, and I think too, it's going to depend on the community. What are the resources of that community? How far can that community go? I mean, if this is a community of people who don't have much money, they're not going to necessarily be able to move forward with suits. So I think it depends on the situation and the circumstances. But yeah, whatever makes it inconvenient and costly, I say do it. But also be militant.
Throw everything you've got at it. Yep, for sure.
Yes, hello. My question actually is similar to the one with Cecile. I've been to some green zones and movement events at the COP, and for example, as we saw also in the US with the Sanders movement, they try to work also inside institutions by cooperating with or endorsing politicians. For example, Alexander Conservateur, so also
Okay, so the question was about political power and whether there is, in the end, any way around the fact that you might need to just get into politics in order to change things. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
this question I can really answer on a very, very personal note. So I actually used to work in politics. I ran campaigns. I was pretty deeply entrenched in the Democratic Party. I was of that mindset of, well, you know, you are one of those few from your community that went to school, got this, you know, higher education, a graduate degree, all this, you know, you can go be the change within the system. And I went and I did that off and on for 10 years. And in the end, I went, there is no change within the system. Any good you can accomplish will be quickly undone in the US. You know, I can't speak to other countries. I can only speak to what I know. I don't think there is doing any good in the system. I don't think it's a matter of we just have to get into power in US government. That's not possible. I mean, I look at Deb Haaland, you know, I have love for her as a Native relative, but as the head of the Department of the Interior, I think she's a sellout. And I'm sure I'm gonna catch some hell from this for some other Native folks, but you know, on her, I believe it was her very first day, you know, she said something to the effect of, we need to find a way to balance tribal sovereignty and domestic energy needs. Well, fuck that.
Yeah.
Like, what good is this, you know? And I'd had conversations with other Natives about Congresswoman Sharice Davids. I was like, you know, I like her, but she doesn't push hard enough. And the response I got was, well, she's in a conservative district. She can't really rock the boat. Well, then what the hell is the point of her being there? You know, and I, in a variety of ways, whether it was ableism, racism, sexism, whatever it was, I saw so much ugliness in the Democratic Party. And I just walked away. I doused that bridge in gas, threw that match, and walked away cackling. You know, I felt like, no, this is not a system you make change in. And, you know, I had worked on a piece of policy. It wasn't climate related. It was related to creating fixed buffer zones around reproductive health clinics to stop the harassment of people going into the clinics in Massachusetts. And I was very proud of that. And then a couple of years later, the US Supreme Court, it was gone. You know, I can't speak to other countries and other governments, but in the US, no. I think there is absolutely no change within the system. There is nothing more than tear that shit down.
Yeah.
Well, I think the question the question that was posed is a very difficult one, a very delicate one, and not one that we can get around. So my answer would, can we get around the question of political power? No. I mean, that's the central question, really, strategically, and it's an incredibly hard nut to crack how to deal with this. If we look at the situation in Germany, for instance, that has the strongest climate movement in Europe and has had it for a number of years, the strategic thinking of a movement like Ende Gelände, which I have identified with quite a lot in recent years, has been to amass sufficient force in collective action to sort of impose on the state the realization that we have to close these mines down and do it as quickly as possible. So, and this is how most social movements operate these days. We raise a demand and we try to push for it, and we want the state to accede to our demand and implement it. Yeah. Now, that strategy in Germany worked to an extent because the German government had to set up the coal commission, but because of the balance of forces, the outcome of that commission was unacceptable with the year 2038 for phasing out lignite coal. And that's so far into the future that it's essentially a worthless date. But you can, of course, see that if the balance of forces would become more favorable to us, you could, if there is a new coal commission, potentially have a better date. However, we cannot think that we can just amass force and become strong enough to sort of remote control the state and force it to do our bidding, because there will have to be a change of guard at some point if we're going to continue impose our agenda on the state. I mean, at some point, the existing governments would say, no, we're not going to go any further because of whatever interests are at stake. And that's where you face a problem of a potential rupture, as in, I mean, in the political tradition that I come from, this could potentially start resembling something like a dual power situation, or, you know, where you have popular forces becoming very powerful and potentially challenging the state, and establishing an alternative locus of power. Yeah. Now, this is all obviously at the level of speculation. I think where we are right now, we need to continue working on precisely building mass force outside of the state and trying to interact with the state and force it to do what's necessary. That's easier to do if the people in charge of the state apparatus are reasonably liberal and at least nominally committed to climate action. I mean, it's not by coincidence that the Keystone XL pipeline was suspended by Barack Obama and then resuscitated by Trump and then suspended again by Joe Biden. In response, of course, to the protests happening in the US, but depending also on the identity of the politicians in charge of the state apparatus. It's easier for our movement to make an impact if the people in power are susceptible to pressure from someone like the climate movement. So in Sweden, for instance, it's better now that we have the Greens in power in government, although they are completely lousy, than having the Sweden Democrats, the neo-fascists in power who are climate denialists and are very likely to come to power after next year's election. This is not to say that I suggest that we should all become parliamentarians, but also if we want a dynamic between our movement and parliamentary politics, we cannot be indifferent to parliamentary power, in my view. Yeah, but these are just some preliminary reflections, because still it doesn't solve the strategic question, and we can discuss many of the problems here. But yeah, I would certainly endorse the view that we cannot ignore the question of political power. At the end of the day, we have to somehow exercise political power. Otherwise, we are by definition powerless.
Yeah, it's a huge question.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. One last one, as we are running.
Sorry, I put my hand up before you mentioned grief things. But it sounds like there's a lot of rage and both of you agree that direct action is a necessary thing. So I wonder what it is that you think is getting in the way of that. Like Andreas, you mentioned it's weird that France, like a country with a revolutionary tradition, doesn't seem to be doing that kind of thing. So I wonder, yeah, what you thought was stuff like that getting in the way.
Wow.
Do you want to begin?
Yeah.
Sure. I think there's a variety of things. I think lack of resources, time. I mean, we're working ourselves to death in the US just to barely survive. Most of the people I know have 3 or 4 jobs. You know, when the hell do you find time to take action when you're struggling to just barely get your bills paid, you know? You know, and for those of us, so like I'm Generation X, but I'm on the younger side, but the younger Gen X and down, like we've been just hit with like horrific student loan debt, a housing crisis, you know, a lack of health insurance. I mean, it could go on and on and on. So I think that's a big part of it, is just when do you have time? When do you have the energy? I think there's maybe a little sense of a hopelessness as well to try to counteract and to come back from. I think there's also a very real sense of fear. You know, when I talk with some of the people in my life, and I'm honest about, you know, what it's like being surveilled by the state, getting death threats, rape threats, hate mail, and things for the work I do. It's hard. It's scary. And I think that reality scares some people away. which, you know, I struggle with, like, how do I encourage people to stand up and take action with, you know, because I want to be honest. I don't want people coming in thinking, oh, it's all going to be easy and great and this isn't dangerous, but also want to encourage people. But I think that's a big part of it. And then we have so many people, like the US is the world's prison capital. Mm-hmm. You know, since Standing Rock, it's just been one piece of legislation after another, like throwing down felonies on people, locking people up for years. I mean, in the US, if you're a rapist, like only 3% of rapists even spend a night in jail. But if you go sit in a tree sit, you know, you're gonna spend months, if not years, in jail. You know, we have somebody who shut down the DAPL pipeline, who Jess Resnick, I believe is their name. I think they're about to serve 4 years for that. You know, the state's coming down really hard on us, and I think that scares people. You know, people are like, I have children, I have aging parents, we have COVID. I think there's a variety of reasons that keeps people from coming forth, but for me, I almost think, I don't know, maybe I'm just a masochist, but the harder you come at me, the more I'm just gonna be like, fuck you, I'll just fight harder. I don't know, I'm stubborn like that, but I think that's a big part of the problem, at least in the States.
Yeah, this is a question I grapple with a lot, and I don't think I have a good answer to it, a full explanation. To me, it is a paradox, this deficit of militancy, if you like, in the climate movement. And I'm not sure that repression, the level of repression, can account for it, because if you compare the climate movement to two other important movements in the global north recently, BLM, the uprising after the murder of George Floyd, and the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in France, you see a completely different relation to property destruction, to confrontational tactics, and militancy in these movements. And that's not because there was no repression against the BLM movement or against the yellow vests. I mean, people had their eyes shot out, you know, systematically, methodically in France. I think that the climate movement in the global north stands out for some of its important branches being committed to strategic pacifism. So the idea that you absolutely must not ever go beyond fully peaceful civil disobedience and never engage in anything like property destruction or something like that. This, to me, quite dogmatic idea has not been similarly endorsed by the BLM movement or the Yellow Vests. And that might have something to do with the environmental movement in the global north. Obviously, it's different with North America, because there you have a much stronger component of indigenous resistance than what we have in Europe. But in Europe, at least, and I think that this goes for at least some parts of the climate movement in the US as well, this movement has its basis in a certain white, well-educated middle class, unlike the BLM and the Yellow Vests, which have been based on, obviously, racialized working-class communities in the US and working-class communities in France. So that might go some way to explain the difference in how to think about tactics and strategy. I cannot help just very briefly commenting on Insulate Britain here, which I'm sure you've followed, those of you who live in Britain. I'm on the one hand in sympathy with what they're doing, and of course, I mean, I've participated in countless road blockades myself, and that's a legitimate tactic. And I'm quite impressed by their stubbornness, their consistency in continuing doing that, what they're doing. But also, I do find it problematic to have these kind of activists who appear to be having a lot of time at their hands and being able to commit to full-time activism, you know, sitting in roads and blocking fairly randomly, indiscriminately people driving their trucks or their cars, and eliciting a lot of rage from ordinary working class people. So there are, you know, being truck drivers saying things like, "Am I stopping you from insulating Britain? Why are you not targeting the millionaire oligarchs instead?" And that's to me a sensible objection to what they're doing. And the risk here is that you get further entrenched the idea that climate activists are alien to the working class and insensitive to how working class people go about their daily lives and their needs for how to put food on their table and things like that. I don't understand why, if you have people who are prepared to go to jail, why don't you organize them to target the consumption of the rich? I mean, we have reports constantly coming out about how absolutely disastrous luxury emissions are, how catastrophically they drive the global heating. I mean, it's not like luxury emissions are just symbolic targets for dogmatic anti-capitalist rage. They are a really statistically significant driver of emissions. And the ultra-rich exist in Britain too. They have their mega yachts and their private jets and their, energy-guzzling mansions and all these things. If you want to spoil someone's day, why don't you go and spoil the rich people's day? I mean, what prevents you from doing that? Where's your basic class consciousness? So, I mean, the climate movement in the global north needs to learn to express social rage and articulate that rage, and it shouldn't be very difficult.
Thank you. Thank you both. This has been absolutely amazing, and I just wish that we could continue for ages. I'm really sorry I have kept you much longer than we'd promised, but I hope that you got something out of that. Thank you so much for your amazing questions, and just a huge round of applause for our amazing speakers. Thanks so much. Yeah. And now, so our speakers will be signing books in the back, which is at the table right at the back. So